Forsen subs, Forsen H joins us. Hello, Mr. Forsen. Hope you're having a good day. Here's a video that might be interesting for you and chat. Start from 251.
The Wizard of Oz is one of the most iconic films in the history of cinema. According to the Library of Congress, it's the single most watched film of all time. Very few artistic works from the 1930s have managed to persist within the public consciousness, but even now, 82 years later, most of you watching know exactly who these characters are. Far less known, however, are the people behind these characters. Principal photography for The Wizard of Oz lasted from October 1938 to March 1939. During these 5 months, the stars of the movie were subject to some of the most horrendous conditions in the history of the American film industry. When it was all said and done, not a single character who set off down the yellow brick road left the land of Oz unscathed.
Five drought even harder than England, rural America is in a desperate plight.
That's not to say that things were much better back home in Kansas. The 1930s were a period of major turmoil and hardship for the American public. The Great Depression ravaged almost every sector of the economy. While most American industries were struggling, the film industry was booming. To escape from the dread of everyday life, most Americans sought refuge in the cinema. Nowadays, about 1 in 10 Americans have gone to the movies in the past week. In the 30s, however, it was not uncommon for half of all Americans to pay a weekly visit to the theater.
What?
Hollywood was in the midst of its...
That's fucking crazy. Half? So every other person has... Damn.
golden age, a period where studios had unparalleled influence over the industry. During this time, the top 8 studios controlled 95% of American cinema, and no studio was more illustrious than MGM. They were the studio widely considered to provide audiences with the biggest stars and the grandest spectacle. MGM smoked the rest of Hollywood with its unmatched financial and critical success. Across the 30s, MGM films accounted for nearly a third of the nominees for Best Picture, and nearly 3/4 of the total profits generated by all 8 major studios. MGM's dominance over Hollywood was due in large part to the strong leadership of its chief executive, Louis B. Mayer, who in 1937 was the highest paid man in America. 1937 also saw the release of one of the most groundbreaking films ever made, and one of the most successful films of the time to not come out of the MGM system. That year, Walt Disney would release his first animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Damn, it's so
the
old.
film was an
I can't
immersive
believe it.
fantasy unlike anything audiences had ever seen, and by the following year had become the highest-grossing film to date.
Fucking
Snow White's
37.
record-breaking success
It's crazy,
inspired
dude. I
MGM
watched
to
this
produce a
movie as a kid,
spectacular
right?
fantasy of their own.
And
In
already
1938,
then,
the studio bought out the
it was
rights to
more
L. Frank
than
Baum's
50 years
popular
old.
children's novel, The Wonderful Wizard
the
of Oz,
fuck?
and the rest was history. A history that some members of the cast and crew wish they could forget. Unlike Snow White, The Wizard of Oz was entirely live action, which presented a series of challenges while attempting to transform fantasy into reality. One of the most iconic scenes in all of cinema is Dorothy waking up in the land of Oz and the film transitioning from sepia to color. The official coloring method used to develop the film was Technicolor, which required heavy exposure due to the process of splitting the image into different color channels. As a result, the Oz set required an exorbitant amount of lighting, so much so that the temperature on stage often surpassed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was suffocating, and stagehands frequently had to be carried off stage after fainting. The set lighting was so intense that some actors even claimed to suffer permanent vision damage. The exhaustion suffered from the oppressive heat was only magnified by the arduous production schedule. For 6 days a week, the actors walked into the studio at 4 a.m. and didn't leave until 7 p.m. A significant part of each actor's day was dedicated to the meticulous preparation and removal of their costumes. The Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion are one of the most recognizable trios in fiction. All 3 characters were brought to life by the skilled design of makeup artist Jack Dawn. While the costumes presented an impeccable external appearance, conditions weren't so pleasant on the inside. Every morning as the Scarecrow, Ray Bolger would have to spend an hour getting his latex and plastic mask painstakingly glued to his face, and every evening he would spend an hour getting it removed. The mask completely covered his facial pores, meaning that he was physically unable to sweat while wearing it. One could only imagine how it must have felt to wear that thing for 15 hours a day. But Ray Bolger didn't have to imagine. For 22 weeks, it was his reality. By the time filming was complete, the repeated applications of the mask left Bolger with permanent grooves around his mouth and chin, but considering what happened to some of the other actors, he may have gotten off easy. The Tin Man was played by Buddy Ebsen for about 9 days. That's how long he lasted during filming until he was hospitalized from a severe reaction to the Tin Man's metallic makeup. Ebsen's silver face paint was made out of aluminum powder that would eventually coat the inside of his lungs, nearly asphyxiating him. As Ebsen sat bedridden under an oxygen tent in the hospital, the studio could not have given him less sympathy. Producer Mervyn LeRoy repeatedly phoned the hospital, angrily insisting that Ebsen return to the set. After 2 weeks out of action, the studio replaced Ebsen with Jack Haley. Much like Pete Best getting cut from the Beatles, Buddy Ebsen would end up becoming one of the unluckiest men in show business. Not only was he unceremoniously fired from what would have been the biggest role of his career, the incident left him with chronic bronchitis. Jack Haley managed to avoid a catastrophic reaction to the aluminum makeup, but it still gave him a severe eye infection that forced him out of work for days. The rest of the suit was so stiff that it rendered Haley unable to sit down or lie down during filming. In order to rest in between takes, he was forced to lean on a reclining board. But despite all the complications it caused, the Tin Man costume may have still been preferable to that of the Cowardly Lion. Burt Lahr's lion suit was compared to carrying around a mattress. The bulk of the costume consisted of a 60-pound lion hide, a real lion hide. Combined with additional padding, some estimates put the weight of the full costume at 100 pounds. Burt Lahr would become drenched in sweat after just a few minutes, and he would frequently have to take off the suit between shots to avoid exhaustion. The prosthetic mask covering his face didn't allow him to fully open his mouth, forcing him to consume all of his on-set meals through a straw. Halfway through production, Lahr gave in and sacrificed an additional hour each day in the makeup chair so that he could eat solid food at lunch. As someone who was known by his peers to be a hypochondriac, Burt Lahr was in near constant agony. But by far the worst costume-related accident during the whole shoot happened to Margaret Hamilton, better known as the Wicked Witch. Nowadays, there are lots of ways to make someone look green, but in 1938, the only tried-and-true method used by Hollywood makeup artists was copper paint. Copper, of course, is toxic when ingested by humans. This was known back then, but the studio showed no restraint in applying the copper concoction directly to Hamilton's face and hands. Towards the end of production, Hamilton realized that the constant application of the witch's makeup had tinted her skin green, an effect that lingered for months after the job.
You wouldn't like
Learning
her
the
when
makeup
she's
on set
angry.
was a constant struggle. Once it was on, Hamilton was unable to touch anything without staining it, and required assistance to perform the most basic of tasks. But the day-to-day struggles of the makeup would pale in comparison to the accident she suffered on December 23, 1938. When departing Munchkinland, Hamilton was scripted to exit the scene in a fiery cloud of smoke. The first attempt at the stunt went flawlessly, but director Victor Fleming wanted to get a few extra takes for insurance. On the fourth attempt, the pyrotechnics were ignited too early, causing Hamilton to be engulfed in flames. The accident resulted in second-degree burns on the whole right side of her face. The skin on her right hand was entirely scalded off. But before Hamilton could even receive medical attention, she had to slowly and excruciatingly have the copper makeup removed from her freshly burned skin with rubbing alcohol. Margaret Hamilton would spend the next 6 weeks in the hospital before returning to the set. On her very first day back, she was scheduled for the skywriting scene, another stunt involving pyrotechnics. Hamilton adamantly refused to put herself...
Did they not have stuntmen back then? Or maybe these people were the stuntmen.
...anywhere near fire again and threatened to walk out of the production right then and there. Since
Like
the
they
project
weren't
was
like
nearing completion at that point,
celebrities.
the studio acquiesced, and the scene was completed using Hamilton's stunt double, Betty Danko. While filming that very scene, the smoke pipe underneath the broomstick exploded, and Danko was violently flung from the installation. The explosion was caused by the special effects crew coating the pipe with asbestos, another toxic substance once thought to be an all-purpose wonder material. Asbestos was also used in Ray Bolger's scarecrow suit as well as the snow in the poppy field scene.
Unusual weather we're having, ain't it?
Betty Danko was hospitalized for 11 days with internal damage from the explosion, as well as a 2-inch deep gash on her leg, a wound that would never fully heal. It was a hefty toll for a gig in which she earned just over $800. The long-term health effects on Margaret Hamilton were far less known. What is known is that she would go on to develop Alzheimer's later in her life, a condition that has been linked to copper poisoning. In total, 6 performers on The Wizard of Oz faced some kind of serious physical trauma. Not even Toto left the set intact. However, after enough time had passed, many of the actors could look back on the whole ordeal as a bunch of amusing war stories. Most physical ailments are only temporary. Mental ailments, on the other hand, tend to stick with you for life. And out of everyone in the Land of Oz, perhaps none suffered a worse fate than the star of the show, Judy Garland. She was without a doubt one of the most talented performers of the 20th century. Her portrayal of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz has served as an enduring symbol of youth and innocence. And even though she was never imprisoned by a brutal costume like the other actors, the studio paid no less scrutiny to her appearance. Since the character of Dorothy was envisioned as a prepubescent girl, the then 17-year-old Garland had to constantly wear a tight corset to hide her more mature figure. But that was merely one aspect of the studio's efforts to keep Judy thin. Garland was placed on a shoestring diet, one that would not provide her with enough energy to complete the arduous filming days. To compensate, the studio kept Garland on a steady intake of amphetamines to keep her working long into the day. The amphetamines subsequently necessitated the use of barbiturates to prevent Garland from exhausting herself. Years later, she claimed that during some periods she would only sleep 4 hours every 3 days. The fact that she was able to perform as well as she did,
I don't think